Hello. Back in the beginning of May, I spoke about an Old Testament character by the name of Nabal. We read about him back in 1 Samuel chapter 25. And with all of his faults, he demonstrated all that a husband should not be. He had the characteristics of a failed husband. However, it points out in places like Romans 3 and verse 23 that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So that includes women as well as men. It includes wives as well as husbands. And as I've discussed in the past, and as I think many of us will understand, a successful marriage requires the positive contributions of both a husband and a wife. So in May, we looked at the characteristics that a man should avoid in order to be a better husband. Today, I want to look at the characteristics that wives can avoid in order to be better wives. And we'll be focusing upon a series of passages in the book of Proverbs, starting with Proverbs chapter 11 and verse 22. And this verse uses a particularly striking contrast, if you like. Proverbs chapter 11 and verse 22, like a gold ring in a pig's snout is a beautiful woman without discretion. Turning that around, of course, into a more positive statement, then the idea is that a successful wife will demonstrate discretion. Discretion translates a Hebrew word which has such meanings as perception, intelligence, judgment, taste, and understanding. Delitzsch, in his commentary on the book of Proverbs, explains the word in this way. Taste carried over into the intellectual region, the capability of forming a judgment, and particularly the capability of discovering that which is right and adapted to the end in view. He goes on to say that involves a mind for the noble, the fine, the fitting, that which in the higher and at the same time intellectual and ethical sense we call tact or fine feeling. Well, what's tact? That's defined in the Macquarie Dictionary as a keen sense of what to say or do to avoid giving offence, skill in dealing with difficult or delicate matters. So basically then we could say that discretion involves knowing what is right in any particular setting or situation. It is that which leads to appropriate speech and conduct in every situation. In Proverbs chapter 11 and verse 22, it is saying that beauty does not compensate for a lack of discretion. A beautiful woman, it says here, without discretion is like beautiful jewellery in the nose of a pig. Now, I used to work for the South Australian Department of Agriculture in Adelaide, and a good friend of mine there worked at the Pig Research Centre on the northern side of Adelaide. And he insisted that pigs were very intelligent and, contrary to popular belief, could be quite clean. And I quite like pigs myself. But even though pigs might be quite likeable as farm animals, you certainly wouldn't dress them up in expensive and beautiful jewellery. The two just don't go together. And the point here in Proverbs is that beauty and a lack of discretion don't go together. Let's just go back for a moment to 1 Samuel chapter 25, and we'll read there from verse 32 in a moment. 1 Samuel 25 and verse 32. This is the passage that we looked at back at the beginning of May and describes the man named Nabal, the husband of a lady named Abigail. And here in this chapter we have two men who don't show much sense. One of them, of course, is Nabal. He is described as a harsh and foolish man who doesn't know how to get along with other people. He is unwilling to listen. He is badly behaved. He rubs people up the wrong way. The other male here is David, the future king of Israel. And in this particular situation, he at first is not showing much sense. He gets so worked up over Nabal's rudeness that he, David, is ready to go and attack Nabal and his men, even though the men haven't done anything. He's ready to attack and even to kill. And so you've got two angry men who are about to confront each other. And into this steps Nabal's wife, Abigail, who does what needs to be done. She recognizes what needs to be done, and she does it, and she helps David to see that his reactions are just completely excessive, completely over the top. And so Abigail, by a good sense, calms the whole situation down. And David recognizes this and acknowledges it. 1 Samuel chapter 25, verse 32, David said to Abigail, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me. Blessed be your discretion." And that's the same word as we have in Proverbs 11 and verse 22. "Blessed be your discretion, and blessed be you who have kept me this day from blood guilt and from avenging myself with my own hand. For as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, who has restrained me from hurting you, unless you had hurried and come here to meet me, truly by morning there had not been left to Nabal so much as one male." So David recognizes his intentions were completely wrong, and he appreciates there, he's grateful for the discretion that Abigail demonstrated. We know that in marriage, as in a whole lot of other settings, discretion is important. And really, it's as important for the husband as it is to the wife. For instance, just to apply it to a setting, a scenario in marriage. You might have a situation where either the husband or the wife is dealing with stress, with grief, with illness, with tiredness, with pain, with frustration. And in such circumstances, there is an appropriate way for the other spouse to react so as to ease the situation rather than creating upset. In fact, if you come over to Proverbs 25, you'll see an illustration of this. Proverbs 25 and verse 20. "Whoever sings songs to a heavy heart is like one who takes off a garment on a cold day, and like vinegar on soda." Vinegar on soda creates a reaction, it all fizzes up and so forth. Or taking off a garment on a cold day, as I record this, there's a cold wind blowing outside. Well, unless you're English like me, you tend to put on more warm clothes. It would be completely inappropriate to go down to t-shirt and shorts on a cold day. And it's saying here that to act happy and jolly with somebody who is feeling really down would be a lack of discretion. There's another illustration over in chapter 27, and this time in verse 14, 27 and verse 14. "Whoever blesses his neighbor with a loud voice rising early in the morning will be counted as cursing." Here you are, your neighbour's trying to rest and have a bit of a sleep in, and there you are bouncing around noisily in the early part of the day, disturbing everybody. That's not going to be counted as appropriate. In fact, that'll be treated the same way as though you were cursing that person. So the point is that to have discretion is to know what is right, what is proper in each and every circumstance, to be able to make that judgment. So that's one characteristic that wives are called to have here in Proverbs 11 and verse 22. And then we go a little bit further and we go to Proverbs chapter 14 and verse 1. And here you have a negative and a positive side to this verse. It starts off with the negative. It starts off with the positive. The wisest of women builds her house. Now, this is not talking about literal house building with bricks and mortar and so forth. It's talking about the idea of building up your household, building up your family, building up the home, if you like, which is your family. There's the idea of a wise woman doing this over in Proverbs, the 31st chapter, the last chapter of this book. Indeed, from Proverbs 31 verse 10 right through to the end of the chapter, it talks about positive qualities that a wife may demonstrate at different times in her life. The question is raised in verse 10. An excellent wife, who can find? She is far more precious than jewels. And I'll just read up the last few verses, starting in verse 25. Strength and dignity are her clothing, and she laughs at the time to come. Why? Because she's prepared. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. She looks well to the ways of her household, and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praises her. Many women have done excellently, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceitful, and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Give her of the fruit of her hands, and let her works praise her in the gates. And so there's the idea of a woman, a wise woman, building up her family. But then going back to Proverbs 14 and verse 1, the second half of the verse approaches it from the negative perspective. But folly with her own hands tears it down. That's the way it reads in the English Standard Version. The New King James Version reads this way. But the foolish pulls it down with her own hands. And again, it's not talking about the literal house, but rather it's saying that a foolish woman will break up her family, wreck the family life. Foolishness is actually quite a common issue dealt with in the book of Proverbs. If my count is correct, then words like folly, fool, foolishness and foolish appear something like 108 times in the book of Proverbs. So more than 3 times a chapter. The International Standard Bible Encyclopedia takes the passages which give the characteristics of foolishness, and it says that the Hebrew word, based upon all those characteristics, indicates one who is hasty, impatient, self-sufficient. That's somebody who just relies on themselves and is not listening to anybody else. They despise advice and instructions. They're ready to speak and to act without thinking, quick to get angry. They tend to quarrel and cause strife, and so on. Let me read that again. A foolish person is one who is hasty, impatient, self-sufficient, despising advice and instruction, ready to speak and act without thinking, quick to get angry and to quarrel and cause strife. That's foolishness according to the Bible. So a woman who is characterized by those qualities is going to have a very negative impact upon the life of her family. And so it would be if it was the father, the husband, who was behaving in such a way, then he would be a home wrecker. And so Proverbs 14 and verse 1 puts a choice particularly two women. On the one hand, behave wisely and you'll build up the family. You'll establish a positive family life around you. As Delitzsch quotes, the family placed in good circumstances with father, mother and children all living together happily and peacefully. But the other choice is, of course, to behave foolishly and thus to wreck the family life around you, to make family life miserable. So the question arises, well, what does it take to overcome foolishness? Well, really, the books of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes are called wisdom literature. And both of those books in the Old Testament give a whole range of issues dealing with how to be wise in regard to all sorts of things. Particularly Proverbs 1 and chapters 1 through 10 talk a lot about developing wisdom. But based upon the negative qualities that we saw earlier associated with foolishness, what would be needed to change? Well, number one, it would require a lot of serious effort. This is not a quick fix situation, but one that's going to require some commitment to stick with it. It requires a willingness to listen and to accept good advice. I know some people who will listen day after day to advice, but they don't apply it. It needs a determination to develop self-discipline, to control the impulse to speak and act too hastily. Instead, learning to think before we act and speak. It also involves a willingness to open our eyes to the consequences of our own behavior. The trouble is sometimes we behave foolishly and create problems, but we can't see that it's us who's creating the problems. So really, this whole thing of developing wisdom is not something that you can deal with in a few sentences or a few days. It's something that really needs a concerted, prolonged effort. But with God's help and with the right advice, we can do that if we're willing to try. Then there's another quality to avoid in marriage, and there's a number of verses actually that mention it. I'll just look at a couple. One of them is in Proverbs chapter 21 and verse 9. It is better to live in the corner of the housetop than in a house shared with a quarrelsome wife. And then we can go over to Proverbs chapter 27 verses 15 and 16. A continual dripping on a rainy day and a quarrelsome wife are alike. To restrain her is to restrain the wind, or to grasp oil in one's right hand. Now, depending upon what Bible version you're reading, these passages involve words like quarrelsome, contentious, brawling, and those words translate two very similar Hebrew words which indicate discord and strife. Let's look at each passage separately. We'll go back to Proverbs chapter 21 and verse 9. It is better to live in a corner of the housetop than in a house shared with a quarrelsome wife. Now, I'm totally aware here that men can also be quarrelsome, and men can make the lives of their wives miserable. But as I keep mentioning here, I did talk about negative qualities of men back in the beginning of May, and so now we're looking at ways in which wives can change their behaviour. And the fact is that wives, like men, can behave negatively. Wives, like men, can sometimes give themselves over to constant arguing. In fact, it seems that there are some people who get a kind of pleasure out of arguing. In the past, in discussing marriage, I've used the term conflict-habituated relationship. And that's the idea of a couple who constantly argue and disagree with one another, and yet they can't live apart from each other. And it's a strange almost contradiction there. They can't live apart, and yet they can't live together without constant disagreement. But the thing is, if you're married to somebody who doesn't like to argue, then in a way, I don't think either one's going to be happy. The one who argues is going to get frustrated because the other doesn't like it, and the one who doesn't like constant argument is going to withdraw in one way or another. Proverbs 21 and verse 9 talks about a physical way of getting away. It is better to live in the corner of a housetop. Now, you imagine in those times, in that part of the world, a lot of housetops were flat. So, yes, you could take yourself up on the housetop to get away from the constant arguing, but it means you're there on your own, exposed to all the elements and so forth, so not a very comfortable way to live. There's also a way in which people can psychologically and socially withdraw from argument, and I'll come back to that in just a while. So you've got this idea here: it's better to live in the corner of a housetop than in a house shared with a quarrelsome wife. Then we go back to chapter 27 and verses 15 and 16. We'll just read verse 15 first of all. A continual dripping on a rainy day and a quarrelsome wife are alike. I remember when my family and I moved to Australia back in 1965, for the first 5 or 6 years, we lived in houses that were on land which was dedicated to the building of Macquarie University. And because the university would eventually destroy or take away all of those houses, they had not been really done up. And in at least one of those houses, we had a very leaky roof and ceiling. And so whenever there was rain, it would start dripping through, particularly in the kitchen. And so you had to get out there with various pots to put under the drips to catch all of the water. And if it was night time, my bedroom was close to the kitchen, and so you'd hear drip, drip, drip. And I'm not a good sleeper at the best of times, and trying to sleep with that going on was not very easy. When Lavinia and I and the children lived in Perth some years back, the downpipe from the roof guttering was right near to our bedroom window on the outside wall. And the trouble was, whenever it was raining, you could hear the water gurgling or dripping in the downpipe. And again, it made things very difficult. And so it says here in Proverbs 27 and verse 15, a continual dripping on a rainy day and a quarrelsome wife are alike. If it's always arguing, it just makes life so miserable. And then it goes on to say in verse 16, to restrain her is to restrain the wind or to grasp oil in one's right hand. Now, it's quite windy outside as I speak right now. There's no way that you can stop that. Or imagine that you've got a bowl of olive oil or something. You can't just grab it like that. It's all going to come away. And so, the idea there seems to be that when there's a lot of arguing going on, or when you've got somebody who loves to argue, you can't stop it. It's very hard to deal with. And that, of course, again, is getting at the idea that life can be made miserable sometimes by the wrong attitude and the wrong conduct of a spouse. I said a while ago that the quieter spouse might just want to get away. They might even separate. They might move somewhere else. They might divorce. Or it may be that they withdraw psychologically. The old image of the husband just burying his head in the newspaper and tuning out, or turning on the TV and just not listening to his wife. The trouble is, when that happens, it makes the other partner more irritable, that so their husband is not willing to listen to them, and so that creates even more anger within the relationship. Why is it that some people are so angry and so argumentative? Well, there's a whole range of possibilities. It might be that they've grown up in a house where there's a lot of arguing, and so they learn from experience to argue, and when they get married, they carry that argumentative nature into their own marriage. It can be unresolved anger. We might even call that bitterness. A person develops some sort of deep-seated anger or bitterness due to something in their own upbringing, and they carry that anger with them. Earlier in this past week, there was a news story on TV, and I just remember that there'd been a relationship breakup, and I think the woman involved had scrawled messages over the other person's car, and one of the messages was something like this: all men are evil. And as I read that, I thought, boy, that person's really angry, really bitter. And you could just picture their feelings, their emotions at the time. Or this argumentative nature can arise out of frustration. It may be that a husband is lazy and his wife is constantly trying to get him to do things, and just about nothing works, and she just gets so frustrated, and she's constantly at him trying to get him to do something. Or it may simply be a difference between personalities. The wife has a character that wants to deal with things and deal with them head on and deal with them straight away, whereas the husband might have a slower, more patient approach to problem solving. And I recognise that it can be the other way around as well. But in that case, the get up and go confrontational type of person just can't bear the other person's quieter, more thoughtful approach. And so that leads to argument. And again, I want to mention here, I'm not saying that it's always the wives that are one way and the husbands that are the positive way. I recognise that both men and women can demonstrate these qualities. But the thing to realise is that constant arguing tends to be counterproductive. In other words, it produces the opposite of what is intended. In technical terms, it creates conflict escalation, that is, it makes things worse, rather than creating conflict resolution, in other words, taking away the conflict. For instance, you start arguing with somebody and it goes on and on. Now, the person might have heard this all before, and so they retreat into themselves, they switch themselves off, and of course then the angry person gets even more angry. Or on the other hand, you've got one spouse is arguing and the other spouse just gets sick of it and they start arguing, and the argument escalates and you're saying things to each other that are downright spiteful and hurtful. And of course in some situations it can get physical as well, or it can split up the relationship and so forth. Arguing is not an effective way to solve problems. You might disagree, all right, disagree, express your disagreement, but don't take it to the nth limit and don't let it drag on and on. There's a passage in James which is relevant for all who have a sort of angry temperament. James chapter 1 verses 19 and 20. Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, for the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. There's something to take heed of. Again, I'm aware that this lesson has focused upon passages dealing with wives, and that therefore I could be accused of being sexist, and the book of Proverbs could be accused of being sexist. I come back to the fact that I dealt with negative behaviour of husbands back at the beginning of May. Furthermore, yes, the book of Proverbs does deal with some negative behaviour among wives. It deals a whole lot of the time with negative behaviour amongst men as well. Men and women are human. We all have a problem with sin. We all have character flaws. And we all need to work at it. Both husbands and wives contribute to the building of a marriage, and therefore both husbands and wives need to recognize their own weaknesses, their own mistakes, their own failings, and strive to overcome them in order to build a marriage that is the way that marriage ought to be and is intended to be. But having looked at husbands a couple of months back, what can wives do? Well, 3 things that we've looked at today. Number 1, work at developing discretion, saying and doing the right thing in every situation and setting. Work at developing wisdom rather than foolishness. Work at developing other ways to deal with situations rather than constant arguing. But let's understand, if we are Christians, Christianity doesn't just apply within the walls of the so-called church building. Christianity has to carry over into every aspect, every relationship of our lives. Christianity can make life better, if we're willing to work at it. And that includes bringing Christianity into the home, into our lives as husbands and wives. Let's pray. Father, you have provided so much guidance to us. Your word is full of practical guidance, but also there are wise people around us who have learned through experience and even through their own mistakes what is wise behaviour, what is foolish behaviour, what is helpful behaviour, what is not helpful behaviour. And so we can learn from them as well, as long as we learn to listen to the right advice and go to the right sources for good information. Lord, help us to open our eyes to the possibility of each one of us growing, developing in every area, learning more and more how to act as your people, but also to act as wives and husbands who help and encourage one another and create a positive family situation. Help us to be humble enough to recognize where we fall short and to do something about that. Thank you that you give us the opportunity to learn. Thank you that you give us the resources to learn. Thank you for your patience and mercy. Lord, we honour you as we honour Christ, and we pray through Christ. Amen. It's nice to have some sunshine again, and hopefully that'll do something with the latest floods. Take care of yourself in the coming week. As always, if you want more information, if you've got questions, please feel free to get in touch. Take care, and hopefully I'll see you again next time. Bye for now.